When the idea of a reunion for the Partridge Family began circulating decades after the final episode aired, fans imagined warmth, laughter, and a return to a simpler television era defined by harmony and bright colors. What they did not see was the quiet refusal of Susan Dey, a refusal that carried far more weight than a scheduling conflict or a lack of interest in nostalgia. Behind that silence was a story shaped by vulnerability, by a young woman thrust into fame before she had the tools to protect herself, and by a private wound that never truly healed. At the height of the show's popularity in the early 1970s, Susan Dey was only a teenager, still learning who she was while millions believed they already knew her. To the audience, she was Laurie Partridge, graceful, kind, endlessly composed, a symbol of innocence wrapped in catchy melodies and a smiling family traveling together on a painted bus. Off camera, however, the line between performance and reality blurred in ways that left lasting scars. Fame arrived too fast and too loud, bringing expectations that she would remain frozen in that image forever, even as her inner world grew more complicated and fragile. The pressure was constant, the attention unrelenting, and every emotion felt amplified under the studio lights. Within that environment, relationships were rarely simple, especially among young actors navigating adolescence in public. One of those relationships would come to define Susan's experience long after the cameras stopped rolling, the connection she shared with her co-star David Cassidy. To the outside world, they were the perfect on-screen siblings, their chemistry effortless and comforting. Behind the scenes, the reality was far more tangled. Susan was quiet and introspective, David charismatic and already learning how to manage the weight of idolization. Their proximity, long hours on set, and the intensity of shared fame created an emotional closeness that Susan struggled to understand at the time. What began as admiration deepened into something heavier, something she carried silently, knowing that the culture surrounding the show discouraged any hint of romance that might disrupt its carefully maintained innocence. David, acutely aware of his status and the risks of crossing certain boundaries, kept his distance, and that distance became its own form of pain. Nothing dramatic happened in public. No scandal splashed across headlines. Only moments of unspoken tension, glances held too long, and feelings that had nowhere safe to go. For Susan, those unexpressed emotions became intertwined with her sense of self, shaping her early adulthood in ways she would only later recognize. Years passed, the show ended, and life moved forward, yet the memories remained sealed away, private and unresolved. Then came the moment that changed everything. Long after Susan had worked to separate herself from her teenage fame and build a new identity, David chose to reveal an intimate detail from their past in his autobiography. A single night, described casually, stripped of context and emotion, was suddenly exposed to the public without her consent. For Susan, it was not a nostalgic anecdote, but a profound betrayal. A moment she had guarded in silence, one bound up with youth, confusion, and vulnerability, was transformed into public property. The past she had tried so carefully to leave behind reached out and pulled her back into the spotlight, reopening wounds she had never invited the world to examine. From that point on, silence became her shield. She did not issue statements or counter-narratives. She did not argue or explain. Instead, she withdrew completely from any attempt to revive the image of the Partridge family as a unified whole. Her refusal to participate in reunions was not an act of bitterness, but an assertion of control, a way of saying that some boundaries, once crossed, cannot be repaired with smiles and nostalgia. The cheerful myth of the perfect television family could not erase the reality of what she had endured. In choosing absence, Susan Dey chose dignity, even if it meant disappointing fans who never knew the full story. Her silence spoke of a deeper truth about fame and memory, about the cost of having one's inner life exposed without permission. Long before the spotlight found her, Susan Dey grew up far removed from the manufactured brightness that would later define her public image. Raised in a modest household, she was shaped by an early sense of responsibility and a quiet independence that set her apart from many of her peers. Modeling work came first, not as a dream of stardom, but as a practical opportunity, and it introduced her to adult expectations at an age when most teenagers were still insulated from them. When acting followed, it did so abruptly, without the gradual acclimation that might have prepared her for the psychological weight of fame. Landing a leading role on the Partridge Family changed everything almost overnight. Suddenly, she was no longer just a young woman learning her craft, but a symbol. Her face reproduced endlessly on posters, magazines, and merchandise that sold an idealized vision of youth and harmony. The pace was relentless, episodes filmed in quick succession, music recorded and promoted, public appearances scheduled back-to-back, leaving little room for reflection or rest. For Susan, the set became both workplace and classroom, where she learned not only how to perform but how to survive under scrutiny. She learned when to smile, when to stay quiet, and how to present a version of herself that felt increasingly distant from who she really was. The role demanded innocence and emotional consistency, yet her real life was defined by rapid change, confusion, and a growing awareness that she was being shaped by forces beyond her control. The family atmosphere promoted by the show was genuine in moments, but it was also a construct carefully maintained to preserve the illusion audiences loved. Within that environment, Susan's natural reserve often left her observing more than speaking, absorbing tensions and undercurrents others overlooked. Fame magnified everything, including insecurities, and she felt the pressure to live up to expectations that had been written for her before she had the chance to define herself. Among her co-stars, one presence loomed particularly large. David Cassidy was not only the breakout star of the series, but also its emotional center, adored by fans and relentlessly pursued by the media. Watching his ascent was both inspiring and isolating. While he appeared comfortable navigating adoration, Susan struggled with the intensity of it, especially as comparisons between them grew more frequent. Their personalities differed in ways that seemed small at first, but gradually widened into an emotional gap. David thrived on connection and attention, while Susan retreated inward, seeking meaning and stability in private moments between takes. The closeness they shared was forged in shared experience rather than romance, born from long hours, mutual reliance, and the unspoken understanding of what it meant to be young and famous. Yet that closeness carried its own risks. For Susan, emotions deepened quietly, without a clear outlet, shaped by admiration, affection, and the vulnerability of adolescence lived in public. The culture surrounding the show left no room for honest exploration of those feelings, discouraging anything that might disrupt its wholesome image. As a result, Susan learned early to compartmentalize, to hide what she felt and channel it into her work. This habit of emotional restraint became a defining feature of her adult life. The success of the show intensified her internal conflict, as the character of Lori Partridge grew more entrenched in the public imagination. Fans wanted continuity, a familiar smile, and reassuring presence, while Susan felt an increasing need to grow, to challenge herself beyond the limits of a single role. The end of the series brought relief, but also uncertainty, as she confronted the reality of being typecast and the fear of being unable to escape the shadow of her teenage fame. Determined to redefine herself, she pursued roles that demanded seriousness and complexity, eventually finding renewed purpose in dramatic television. Yet even as her career evolved, the past lingered, its unresolved emotions tucked away but never fully erased. The formative years she spent on that set had shaped her understanding of trust, privacy, and the cost of exposure. She had learned that silence could be protective, that not every truth needed to be shared, and that some experiences lost their meaning when removed from their context. These lessons would later inform her most consequential decisions, including her refusal to revisit a chapter of her life that the world continued to romanticize. For Susan Dey, the story of her youth was not a nostalgic memory, but a complex landscape of growth, pressure, and unspoken pain, one she carried with her as she moved forward, carefully choosing which parts of herself to reveal and which to keep guarded. As time moved forward and the distance between youth and adulthood widened, the unresolved tensions from Susan Dey's early fame began to surface in more painful and defining ways, turning what had once been quiet discomfort into a deeply personal crisis. By the time the public nostalgia machine started revisiting the legacy of the Partridge Family, Susan had already spent years reshaping her identity, working deliberately to be seen as more than a relic of teenage television. Her success in serious drama had given her professional legitimacy, but did not erase the emotional residue left behind by her adolescence in the spotlight. The past returned not gently, but abruptly, when David Cassidy published his autobiography and chose to reveal a private moment they had shared decades earlier. The disclosure was brief, almost casual in tone, yet its impact was devastating. For Susan, it was not the act itself that cut deepest, but the way it was stripped of nuance and context, presented as a footnote in someone else's narrative rather than a vulnerable experience she had never consented to share. The revelation collapsed the fragile boundary she had built between her public persona and her private life, exposing a wound she believed time had sealed. In an instant, a memory that belonged solely to her was transformed into public property, inviting speculation, judgment, and renewed scrutiny. The emotional fallout was immediate and profound, even if it unfolded largely out of view. Susan did not issue statements or seek to correct the story, but those close to her sensed the shock and hurt beneath her silence. It was as though the past had reached forward and reclaimed a piece of her present, reminding her that fame, once tasted, rarely releases its grip entirely. The disclosure recontextualized her entire experience on the show, turning moments she had once understood as private into fodder for public curiosity. Trust, already fragile from years of living under observation, shattered completely. What made the situation especially painful was the asymmetry of power. David's voice, amplified by celebrity and a best-selling book, dominated the narrative, while Susan's choice to remain silent was interpreted by some as indifference or mystery rather than self-protection. The media framed the revelation as nostalgia gossip, a harmless anecdote from a bygone era, overlooking the ethical breach at its core. For Susan, the experience underscored a harsh truth she had learned early but hoped she had outgrown, that her story could be appropriated and reshaped without her permission. The resurgence of interest in the show during the 1990s and early 2000s intensified the pressure. Reunion offers multiplied, each one promising celebration and closure, yet each also carried the implicit expectation that she would stand beside the man who had exposed her private history. Accepting such invitations would have required her to perform forgiveness she did not feel and to publicly legitimize a version of events that had caused her deep harm. Internally, the conflict was stark. She understood the affection fans held for the show and recognized the joy a reunion might bring them. But she also knew that participation would come at the cost of her own emotional integrity. The betrayal she experienced was not a fleeting offense, but a reopening of adolescent vulnerability, a reminder of how easily her boundaries could be ignored. In choosing refusal, Susan confronted the enduring imbalance between public desire and personal well-being. Her decision was not impulsive, but the culmination of years spent navigating the consequences of exposure. Silence became her final assertion of agency, a refusal to be drawn back into a narrative that had long ceased to reflect her truth. The emotional weight of that choice was heavy, isolating her from former colleagues and from a shared cultural memory that others seemed eager to relive. Yet it also marked a turning point, solidifying her commitment to protecting what remained private. The tragedy of the situation lay not in a single revelation, but in the cumulative effect of years spent having one's inner life treated as spectacle. For Susan Dey, the past was not merely something to remember or forget, but something that continued to exert force, shaping her responses and reinforcing her resolve to remain unseen when visibility demanded too much. The crisis she faced was both deeply personal and emblematic of a broader truth about fame, that once private experiences are made public, they can never be reclaimed, only endured. The consequences of that long-buried betrayal did not explode in a single public moment, but unfolded slowly, shaping Susan Dey's life in ways that were quiet yet enduring. After the revelation became part of the public record, the immediate aftermath was marked by absence rather than confrontation. Susan withdrew further from anything connected to her early fame, and that withdrawal was felt not only by fans but also by the people who had once shared that defining chapter of her life. Invitations to participate in interviews, retrospectives, and reunion projects continued to arrive, each one reopening the same internal conflict. Every request carried an unspoken assumption that time had softened the damage, that nostalgia could override the pain, and that a smile on stage could erase what had happened in private. For Susan, the opposite was true. Time had clarified rather than diminished the harm. The deeper impact was psychological, rooted in the realization that her boundaries, once violated, could never be fully restored. Trust, once broken so publicly, reshaped the way she related to both people and institutions. She became more guarded, more selective about the narratives she allowed herself to be part of, and more determined to maintain control over how much of her inner life was visible. This caution extended beyond her former co-stars and into her broader relationship with the entertainment industry. While she continued to work and earn respect for her performances, she avoided the spotlight whenever it drifted toward personal history rather than professional achievement. The emotional toll was not always visible, but it manifested in a persistent distance from anything that resembled the world that had once consumed her youth. The show that had launched her career now existed as a cultural artifact, celebrated and replayed, while she stood deliberately apart from its ongoing mythologizing. That separation carried its own cost. By refusing to engage, Susan sacrificed the easy affection that often comes with shared nostalgia. She allowed others to define the collective memory of that era without her voice, accepting misunderstanding as the price of peace. For many observers, her silence was perplexing, even frustrating, interpreted as aloofness or resentment. Few recognized it as an act of self-preservation. The absence of her perspective meant that the public narrative remained incomplete, shaped largely by voices less affected by the ethical weight of disclosure. In this imbalance, Susan's story became a reminder of how power operates in celebrity culture, where those who speak are amplified and those who remain silent are often overwritten. The long-term consequences also touched her sense of identity. Having spent her adolescence defined by an image she did not choose, she spent adulthood resisting further reduction. Her refusal to participate in reunions was not a rejection of her past, but a refusal to relive it on terms that ignored its complexity. Emotionally, the decision demanded resilience. It required her to endure periodic waves of attention and speculation without responding, to watch anniversaries and tributes unfold without her presence, and to accept that closure, as the public understands it, was not something she could offer. The grief embedded in that choice was subtle but real, a mourning not just for what had happened, but for what could never be repaired. When David Cassidy passed away, the consequences of her earlier decisions became even more pronounced. The world turned toward remembrance, expecting shared mourning and public reflection. Susan's continued silence was again scrutinized, yet remained consistent with the boundaries she had established years before. For her, participating in collective grief would have required reopening wounds she had fought to protect. The aftermath of that loss reinforced the permanence of her choice. There would be no reconciliation, no symbolic reunion, no public healing moment. What remained instead was a life carefully constructed around privacy and autonomy. The broader impact of her decision extended beyond her own experience, offering a quiet commentary on the cost of nostalgia when it disregards consent. Susan Day's absence became a statement about the limits of forgiveness and the necessity of honoring personal truth, even when it conflicts with public expectation. Her story illustrates how the aftermath of betrayal can ripple outward, influencing not only relationships, but the very shape of a life. The consequences were not dramatic in the way headlines favor, but they were profound, shaping a legacy defined as much by what she refused to do as by what she achieved. Behind the public decisions and carefully maintained silence, there existed a layer of Susan Day's story that few ever saw, composed not of dramatic confrontations, but of small, private moments that accumulated quietly over time. These were the years when she learned how to live with memories she could not erase and truths she chose not to explain. Friends who knew her away from the industry often described her as thoughtful and observant, someone who listened more than she spoke, carrying a deep awareness of how words, once released, could never be taken back. In private conversations, she rarely revisited her early fame unless asked directly, and even then her reflections were measured, focused less on specific incidents and more on how the experience shaped her understanding of trust and vulnerability. There were evenings spent alone, long walks taken without destination, moments when she deliberately disconnected from the noise of public life to regain a sense of grounding. These habits were not affectations, but coping mechanisms, small rituals that allowed her to maintain emotional balance in a world that had once felt overwhelming. Those close to her noticed how carefully she guarded personal boundaries, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. She had learned early that intimacy could be misunderstood, reshaped, and ultimately weaponized by fame. This awareness informed how she formed relationships later in life, choosing depth over breadth, privacy over exposure. Even in professional settings, she avoided conversations that drifted toward nostalgia unless they served a meaningful purpose. The past, for her, was not a performance piece, but a lived experience with consequences that did not fade simply because time had passed. There were also moments of quiet reckoning, times when memories surfaced uninvited, triggered by a song on a radio or an old photograph glimpsed unexpectedly. In those moments, the emotional weight of adolescence lived in public returned, reminding her of how little control she once had over her own narrative. Rather than confronting these memories publicly, she processed them internally, often through reflection and distance. Colleagues who worked with her later in her career remarked on her professionalism and emotional intelligence, traits forged in part by hardship. She brought a seriousness to her roles that suggested a deep understanding of human complexity, an understanding rooted not only in training but in lived experience. These unspoken layers informed her performances, giving them a quiet intensity that resonated with audiences even when the source of that depth remained invisible. The stories she never told publicly were not secrets in the traditional sense, but fragments of a life she chose to keep whole rather than dissect for consumption. Some acquaintances recalled how she would deflect intrusive questions with grace, redirecting conversations toward work or broader reflections on art and storytelling. This ability to navigate curiosity without surrendering privacy became one of her defining strengths. It allowed her to remain present in her profession while protecting the parts of herself that had once been exposed without consent. Over time, the absence of public confession became a form of integrity, a way of honoring her younger self who had lacked the power to speak freely. In choosing not to revisit certain chapters aloud, she preserved their meaning on her own terms. These quiet choices accumulated into a life shaped by intention rather than reaction. While fans speculated and commentators filled the gaps with assumptions, Susan continued to live deliberately, valuing peace over validation. The unseen effort required to maintain that peace was significant, involving constant discernment about what to share and what to withhold. It meant accepting that some people would never fully understand her reasons and that misunderstanding was preferable to self-betrayal. The untold stories were not erased. They were simply carried differently, integrated into her sense of self rather than displayed as evidence. In this way, her silence was not emptiness but containment, holding experiences that remained meaningful precisely because they were not diluted by repetition or spectacle. The quieter chapters of her life reveal a resilience that is easy to overlook, a strength defined not by confrontation but by restraint. They show how healing can occur away from the spotlight, through patience, reflection, and the courage to prioritize inner truth over external approval. As the years placed more distance between Susan Dey and the chapter that first defined her, the meaning of her story began to shift from personal survival to something broader and more resonant. Her career, once introduced to the world through the lens of youthful innocence, matured into a body of work marked by restraint, intelligence, and emotional depth. That evolution was not accidental. It reflected a conscious rejection of spectacle in favor of substance, a decision shaped by the lessons she learned early about the cost of visibility. In stepping away from the nostalgic pull of her past, Susan demonstrated that legacy is not only built by what is embraced, but also by what is refused. Her absence from reunions and retrospectives was often framed as loss, as something missing from the collective memory of a beloved show. Yet in a quieter sense, that absence became a statement, challenging the assumption that public affection grants unlimited access to private history. For Susan, legacy was inseparable from autonomy. She chose to be remembered not solely as a symbol of a bygone era, but as an individual who asserted control over her narrative long after the applause faded. This decision required a willingness to accept misunderstanding and criticism, to stand firm even when silence was interpreted as coldness. Over time, that firmness revealed itself as a form of integrity. Her life illustrated how dignity can coexist with success, and how growth sometimes demands distance from the very moments that once brought recognition. The contrast between her early fame and her later choices highlights a fundamental tension within celebrity culture, the expectation that gratitude should be perpetual and unconditional. Susan quietly rejected that premise, showing that gratitude does not require perpetual participation. By declining to relive experiences that cause pain, she affirmed that personal peace is a valid endpoint, even if it conflicts with public desire. The shadow of her early relationship with David Cassidy remained part of the cultural conversation, but Susan's refusal to engage reframed that shadow as a cautionary tale rather than a romantic footnote. It underscored the importance of consent not only in action, but in memory and storytelling. Her story invites reflection on how narratives are constructed and who is given the authority to tell them. In a world that rewards disclosure, Susan's restraint offered an alternative model, one where value is not measured by confession, but by coherence of self. The legacy she leaves behind extends beyond her performances to the example she set in protecting her boundaries. Younger generations of performers, facing similar pressures amplified by social media, can find her choices a reminder that it is possible to step back without erasing oneself. Her life suggests that healing does not always require confrontation or explanation, and that silence, when chosen freely, can be a powerful form of self-definition. The enduring impact of Susan Dey's story lies in this balance between vulnerability and strength, between the light of fame and the shadow it casts. She reminds us that the past does not demand endless revisitation, and that honoring one's history sometimes means allowing it to remain unfinished in the public eye. Through her decisions, she transformed what might have been seen as retreat into a lasting statement about respect, privacy, and the right to move forward unencumbered by old expectations. As the story draws to its quiet close, what remains is not the image of a reunion that never happened, but the deeper resonance of a life shaped by deliberate choice. Susan Dey never offered the public the cathartic moment it wanted. The final scene where past wounds are smoothed over and everyone stands together beneath warm studio lights. Instead, she offered something more challenging and ultimately more honest, the example of a person who chose self-respect over spectacle. Her refusal to return was not a rejection of her audience or a denial of gratitude for the opportunities she received. It was an acknowledgement that some experiences leave marks that cannot be erased by time or applause. In stepping away, she reminded the world that healing does not always look like reconciliation, and closure does not always arrive in public view. The culture of nostalgia thrives on the idea that the past can be revived without consequence, that memories are static and harmless. Susan's story disrupts that illusion, revealing how the past can remain active, exerting influence long after its surface details fade. Her silence was not emptiness but intention, a boundary drawn to protect what remained of her inner life. For fans, that boundary may have felt disappointing, yet it also carried an implicit invitation to reconsider what is owed to the public and what belongs solely to the individual. Susan's legacy is therefore not confined to the role she played, but expanded by the principles she upheld. She demonstrated that identity is not fixed by early success, and that it is possible to outgrow even the most iconic beginnings. In a world increasingly driven by disclosure and constant visibility, her restraint stands as a counter-narrative, one that values coherence over confession and peace over performance. The unanswered questions surrounding her absence may linger, but they also serve a purpose, reminding us that not every story requires a final reveal. Some truths retain their power precisely because they are not revisited, dissected, or repackaged. As time moves forward, the memory of the Partridge Family will continue to evoke joy for many, while Susan Dey's absence from its reunions will remain a quiet footnote, easily overlooked yet deeply significant. It marks the place where a person chose herself over a myth, and where personal dignity outweighed collective nostalgia. In that choice lies the enduring lesson of her story, that the right to step away is as meaningful as the decision to step into the spotlight. Her life affirms that the past can be honored without being relived, and that sometimes the bravest ending is the one that happens off camera, unseen but resolute. If you want, I can revise, tighten, or adapt the full script for pacing or platform requirements.